Hello everybody. As I don't trust this little device, I put the thing myself and see whether we can talk today about the obstacles to communication, archetypal obstacles to communication. First of all, let me just thank you all for subscribing. Hope that we will be continuing with all sorts of little meditative chats and see whether I can persuade you to be inspired by it, invited by it, and wonder about. At the beginning, let me just quote Lao Tzu, one of my favorite thinker, and a wonderful quote about the words. Truthful words are not beautiful. Beautiful words are not truthful. Good words are not persuasive. Persuasive words are not good. Isn't that just something else? I think Kipling said that the greatest aphrodisiac and addiction of humanity are the words. And probably he was right. And of course we produce the words in all sorts of ways. And now the point is whether we can actually appreciate what producing words and communication and miscommunication is all about, and why I use the archetypes on that, and why the archetypes are important. As a union-oriented therapist, I pay attention to my own archetypes and the kind of two sides of archetypes as much as to people's archetypes, people I work with or I have in my personal life. The archetypes energy, if you use start with the Greek word arcane, means original and old, which means the pattern, a model or a type of human beings, which is driven by archetype unconsciously. We can be driven by family complexes, by resentment and anger and grief and shame and all sorts of emotions. We can be driven by archetypes. They're very powerful, very dangerous, because it's no good for us to identify with one archetype or indeed be controlled by one or be driven by one. And how we recognize those archetypal patterns, how we comprehend, can really determine our success. Success in the marriage, in communication, in the job. By the way, lots of businesses use archetypal psychology. Disney World and Disney films are all about archetypes. Art is all about archetypes. Humanity and history is driven by archetypes, as Jung would put it. So they seem to be very important. So let's see whether we can kind of wonder a bit about archetypes and see why they are more important than the types of people, so to speak. Because sometimes we claim through our ego that we know oneself and we understand it and we comprehend who other person is. But it's the archetype which makes the type we are, not vice versa. I often say, when I look at from a social point of view, historical point of view, that the patriarchy was organized by the masculine archetypes, and that's our past in a way, and our future belongs to the feminine archetypes, which are paying attention more on communion, communication, respect for earth, the sage, the wise woman, and the shadow is the witch, which is very, very dangerous for communication. So as far as say archetype of a therapist or a priest or communicator, there are quite a few very pronounced archetypes in that respect. I can say that I am definitely recognizing the hero in me, or the trickster in me, or the the joker in me, the court jester, the at this my age, the wise woman, hopefully, the old, sage in the masculine sense, and the really a wisdom container of the spiritual archetypes. Carl Jung always said that every powerful idea in history was driven by archetypes. Communications are driven by archetypes. And it's worth, looking at our own and what makes us tick, because the more we understand our own, the more we will comprehend our ones as well. And so we're not going to be only addicted to the most powerful drug known to mankind, as Kipling would put it, to our words and producing words, because there are various archetypes, the seducer, the femme fatale archetype, the puella, about words. They are not necessary about communication. Just because we produce a lot of words doesn't mean that we have a good communication. And in that respect, we have to maybe reflect whether we understand and comprehend and sense the meaning of our words, or have a relationship to ourselves, to our archetypes, or recognize a few of them, so we can then speak, so to speak, before we open our mouth. We must kind of reflect a bit. Scott Peck, and I quote Scott Peck here because he's a very interesting a man who wrote quite extensively on the journey, spiritual journey, and one of his famous book was called The Road Less Traveled, a classic in these days, where he explored, various aspects of human communication. Various other books were written. Many people address this subject, and Scott was about the communication, about the healing, and that's what he said about the communication among us. And I quote: "The overall purpose of human communication is, or should be, reconciliation. It should be ultimately serve to lower or remove the walls of misunderstanding which unduly separates us, human beings, one from another." So in other words, good communication gels us, and if we comprehend what the good communication is all about, that's important in every aspect of human relationship, whether it's work, whether it's marriage, whether it's friendship, whether it's just a good neighborhood. I like the quote of George Bernard Shaw about communication, which is quite funny. "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." And and that is, of course, for the fantasists and for the wishful thinkers, this illusion is quite common. I know something about it. Because, of course, the essence of communication and why we must recognize each other's archetypes and what is driven us, on what makes us, what is underneath the only words, bubbles, and mental, intellectual kind of explanations, is accepting the difference of one another and recognizing what is this person operating on which kind of energies are there. So the more we organize and recognize in ourselves, the more we have the capacity. So it's really about the psychic life, inner life. I'm not talking about intellectual life, although intellect is here useful to communicate that. So recognizing which archetypes are obstacle to communication is very important, because it helps us to unveil those unknown parts of ourselves. That's kind of what we Jungians call the work on the shadow. Because archetypes are universal, repeated energy patterns, it's once we kind of name a few, it is quite fun. At the same time, it is freeing and sometimes frustrating, sometimes very, very frightening when we recognize more murky, negative archetypes in us. Say killer, or trickster, or gambler, or conman, or seducer, or femme fatale. So there's quite a lot of them, enormous amount. Jung recognized about 12 basic archetypes, but at the moment, as the internet is going and technology and things, there's quite a few modern archetypes which are already constellated. Of course, art is about archetype. Film, music, that's also communication, yeah? As I always say, even water communicates with us, let alone the picture or the sound. It helps, therefore, if we see see as much as we can see it. The beauty of communication depends on those archetypal energy inside us. That gives us kind of strength. It hopefully gives us a respect for one another. It gives us a bit of space between us, and it makes us slightly less hot-headed. Because archetypes are unconscious, they are visible in our behavior, in our attitudes to life, in the way how we treat one another. But as Jung always stressed, that we can be totally, I call that internally possessed by one archetype, and it could be so accurate that it would practically be possession down to the smallest details, and it would determine his life. It can be benign possession or toxic possession, yeah? In a sense, artists are possessed. Jack London always talk about it. I'm not alcoholic, and I don't write well because I'm an alcoholic. I write well because I'm an artist. But many psychiatrists and many even Freudian people were writing about this kind of creative possession. Yeah, that it is like you possessed, you compelled to write a play, or you hear the music in your head. It's that kind of, and it is therefore common to compare that to addiction. And many people explore that particular theme, how the archetypal possession of artists can be to that degree similar, although in outcome is completely different to the addiction, to the possession of addiction. If we traumatize, if we completely in the excruciating inner conflicts, if we never had anyone who taught us or received us or stay with us through that conflict, then of course the archetype of the brokenness, of the trauma would be taking possession of us, and we will not be able to communicate well. And in that respect, we need somebody, pray to God, tough enough, loving enough to cope with someone who never been hurt and who would be perpetually demanding unconsciously that kind of space to be heard. Yeah, it could be 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old person who didn't do any healing and would be kind of throwing at the partner the inner child or demanding this kind of presence of an almighty mama. So if you haven't got the archetype of a mama, or say you have an archetype of a killer as a husband or a witch, then disaster will take place. Communication, communion, union, it's an art, and meaningful communication is the greatest art of all, like a bit like virtuoso piano playing. And if we don't know what meaningful communication is all about, we're not going to bring meaning to our communication. Yeah, if we are possessed by archetype of a teenager, that's not going to be a communication. They usually don't possess indeed many words, and they don't have any interest in communication. And that teenager may be 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. But the archetype of a puerus would be there. And Jung, and many Jungians were saying that this puerus aeternus, kind of puella eterna archetypes, are such a hindrance that it's practically impossible to bring people to sobriety, in a sense. That is such an obstacle. That people are like snakes. They are very Mercurian, they're very trickery, and they slip out of our hands and our presence, and they're not interested in communication. One of the businessmen once said that the biggest problem of communication is that we do not listen to understand or to receive, but we immediately want to reply. And that is, of course, this impulsiveness, immature, probably a person who might be a director in a boss, but go, quickly, push, and that creates a nervy sort of energy. I remember George Eliot once said, and somewhere I find it, finding my quotes, blessed is the man who, having nothing to say, abstains from giving worldly evidence of the fact. She was good with words. And of course, if we are good talkers, that means we are good listeners. That means that the archetype which would be working for us would be the archetype of a sage, the archetype of the hero, the archetype of a mama or papa, or many other teacher possibly. Yeah. But if you have an archetype of the, court jester, or archetype of a bully, that the communication would be not very much possible. And life is about conversing. It's about communicating. The whole life is about words, but communication could be also without the words. Art is good communication. Even as I say, sea can communicate to us. God communicates to us through revelations. Yeah. So that's what is revealed to us. Yeah. The wisdom is that what is reflected experience. So those are the archetypal possibilities. Yeah. There are various forms of communication. And if we are alert to it, if we are willing to experience that and work on it, this enriches our life immeasurably. But as one woman once said in the interview, I think it was an actress, communication can ruin perfectly good relationship. If you do the relationship, if you do life and you have no desire to communicate, then it would be ruined, It's important that we wonder a bit, read a bit, so we can acquire maturity and also sophistication, as I call it, psychological sophistication. Because even with marriage, as one psychologist said, marriage is for the mature, not for infantile. And in other words, it's for sober people who are a bit in touch and more than average. And therefore, the quality of your communication in every aspect, in every relationship, will depend how much you recognize about yourself and how much you can spot in another person what is driving that person, what is behind that facade, or that words, or that statement, or that silence. If you are traumatized, if you're emotionally encapsulated, or we call it emotionally autistic, you're not going to be a good communicator, if at all. You will have absolutely no comprehension what communication is all about. And if you have two people who maybe charm themselves at the beginning and have no capacity or tools for communication, that's a disaster. And that would be the problem, of course. if you can't sort of sit down and put on the paper what archetypes you recognize, you can probably have a bit of fun with one another. If you are the archetypally abused, kind of generationally abused person, there are so many studies which are given to that and suggest that the abused people are abused more. It's almost like the victim archetype is so powerful that you almost invite the problem for yourself. That applies to rape cases, to psychically raped, to Holocaust survivors. There were lots and lots of studies done about the subject and how those powerful archetypes can shape our life. It is invisible world, psychic world, which is as important for us to enter and to know, the same way as to recognize instincts and instinctual life and our body and care for it. As we feed ourselves, as we care for ourselves, it's also important to comprehend that we have to care for, psychically for ourselves and be a bit more sophisticated than just obvious, brain activity. Brain, in any case, did not develop well if you damaged naturally as a child. Because if we don't communicate well, there's lots of misunderstanding, and we spend our time trying to sort out this misunderstanding perpetually, and projection and triggers, of course, and enormous amount of energy goes into that. So it's like throwing most of your money into the dustbin and then being surprised that you don't have anything left for a good dinner. That is how blind we can be. As Oscar Wilde once put it about people in love, that love is a misunderstanding between two fools, because we have so much projection and so much archetypal kind of force which drives us to be enmeshed that we can only be psychotic about it. And it's a good statement that it is. It's the holy fool archetype. It's a little girl archetype. It's the romantic archetype. No good. I often think that Shakespeare's plays or poems or literature is about archetypes. Theater, music, everything is about communication and archetypes. And those Greek plays, comedy, tragedy, they appeal to us because they touch our own archetypes. They touch us at the deeper level. In a sense, we don't have enough, you see, and that's why you see now with these lockdowns and things, we are suffering because there is no food for our psyche. There is no food for our souls. We are not exposed to that what keeps us going. So it's much more powerful than we think. That we need that. It's our food, and so we can reorganize ourselves after even seeing good play, whether it's tragedy, whether it's comedy. We can lose everything if we don't communicate. Yeah, that's a basic for our humanity. And often, also this communication of ours is violent, yeah, and so we always say from the spiritual religious point of view that it grieves God that we communicate so badly. He gave us a lot and we are using so little, we are such a fools that we cannot make it, yeah, and that creates huge violence between us. Archetype of a wise woman is not about having grey hair or eccentric clothes. That's very shallow, because the wise woman, opposite to the witch, of course, which is essentially one of the most terrifically dangerous archetype in communication, kills everything. through jealousy, through messing about, which possession is almighty. And I always say that at the beginning and at the end of the day, I work with the witch. I face the witch in my room with people every day, and in my life, of course. Every woman has to face a witch, and every man has to face a witch. For a woman to be potent, to be pregnant, she has to face the witch. And the man as well, yeah? And every man must face the killer archetype, but so does the woman must face the killer archetype. So you see, they are more probably dominant in men and women, certain archetypes, but all of them we carry, and we have to look at that. And it's common that we think, I remember somewhere in a party, somewhere with colleagues, therapists, one lady, young, silly, I asked her who she is, and she was saying, oh, I'm a prostitute, I have an archetype of prostitute. I said, do you comprehend what you're saying? So I asked her whether she understands the holy prostitute I am. And she looked at me and blinked her beautiful eyes and went silent. I said, well, go and read about Greek mythology and Greek culture, and then recognize what you just said. Because just because you wear funky clothes and saying such a wild description of yourself is dangerous. And I just move away. The holy prostitutes, the story is that, every young woman who went to place where Vestas were staying had to serve a passerby once, so she's not tempted to be a prostitute ever. And that's a long story in a nutshell. So it's good to read classics sometimes, because they are wonderful communication about where we come from. I always say to people, don't assume that your partners know everything in a relationship. Don't assume. Relationship must not be based on assuming. Relationship must be based on communication. And communication is about recognizing in us those situations. Somebody once said, and that's in my training as well, I've heard that saying, I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I am not sure that you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. Very interesting, yeah? So in the relationship, we have to really, truly listen very carefully and try to comprehend, do I hear what that person meant? Do I recognize what archetype is at work? Another thing which I come to conclusion and always share that with my friends and patients, that I don't want to waste my time trying to explain who I am to people who are all the time dedicated and committed to misunderstand me. And my goodness, have I done that many times. And that is really waste of time and waste of energy. Let me just quote something at the end, which Virginia Satir said about communion, family and health. Virginia Satir, a remarkable woman, a great therapist, family therapist of 20th century in America. Feeling of worth can flourish only in an atmosphere where individual differences are appreciated. Mistakes are tolerated, communication is open, and rules are flexible. The kind of atmosphere that is found in maturing and nurturing and nurturing family, which of course, where we're coming from broken families with traumatized families, the communication would probably be very strained because the archetypes of the brokenness will be so present. Goethe once said, so long as you live and work, you will be misunderstood. To that you must resign yourself once and for all. Be silent. Let's say serenity prayer. God grant us serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Let's see whether I can turn that. Bye for now. If not, I'll just get up and tell.